The British government just collapsed. Not from an election, not from a vote of no confidence, but from something far more explosive. The UK Supreme Court has issued an order that sent shockwaves through Westminster, Downing Street and every corner of the British establishment. Prime Minister Keir Starmer is facing the unthinkable, a direct judicial order to resign over a staggering £124,000 corruption scandal. This isn't political theatre. This isn't opposition grandstanding. This is the highest court in the land, declaring that the man running Britain is unfit to hold office. The evidence is damning. The implications are catastrophic, and what's about to unfold will rewrite British political history. Right now, as you're watching this, emergency meetings are happening behind closed doors. Lawyers are scrambling, and the entire Labour government is on the brink of total meltdown. This is the scandal they desperately tried to bury, the corruption they thought would never see daylight, and the reckoning that nobody saw coming. The first tremors started months ago, but nobody paid attention. While Keir Starmer stood in Parliament lecturing about integrity, transparency and holding the powerful accountable, a financial trail was being uncovered that would ultimately destroy him. The figure is staggering, £124,000. That's not pocket change. That's not a minor accounting error. That's a systematic pattern of undisclosed payments, hidden donations and financial arrangements that violate every ethics rule in the British political system. And the Supreme Court didn't just stumble upon this information. They were handed a meticulously documented case that traced every pound, every transaction, every attempt to conceal the money trail. And what they found was corruption at the very top of British government. The scandal centres around luxury gifts, private accommodations and personal benefits that Starmer received but conveniently forgot to declare. We're talking about designer clothing worth thousands of pounds, luxury apartment stays in some of London's most exclusive addresses and VIP access to events that would cost ordinary citizens a small fortune. But here's where it gets truly explosive. These weren't random acts of generosity from old friends. These were calculated gifts from individuals and organisations with direct interest in government policy. People who stood to gain from favourable decisions made at the highest levels of power. People who expected something in return for their generosity. This is the textbook definition of corruption. The exact behaviour Starmer built his entire political career opposing. The investigation revealed something even more sinister. When questions first started being asked, there were attempts to hide the evidence. Documents mysteriously went missing. Financial records became difficult to access. Witnesses suddenly became unavailable for questioning. The cover-up was almost as damaging as the original crime because it showed consciousness of guilt. It showed that Starmer and his inner circle knew exactly what they were doing, knew it was wrong, and actively work to prevent the truth from emerging. That's not a mistake. That's not an oversight. That's deliberate, calculated corruption, followed by an equally deliberate cover-up. The Supreme Court justices didn't mince words in their preliminary findings. They described a pattern of behaviour that was inconsistent with the standards expected of any public official, let alone a Prime Minister. They noted the systematic nature of the undisclosed benefits, the attempts to conceal them, and the clear conflict of interest they represented. But more than that, they highlighted something that cuts to the very heart of democratic governance. The Prime Minister had violated the trust of the British people. He had positioned himself as a reformer, a man of integrity who would clean up British politics after years of Conservative scandals. Instead, he had engaged in the very same corrupt practices he had condemned in others. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The betrayal was complete. What makes this Supreme Court intervention so unprecedented is the constitutional earthquake it represents. In the British system, the judiciary rarely intervenes directly in political matters. There's a careful separation of powers, a respect for parliamentary sovereignty, and a tradition of letting political problems be solved through political means. But this case was different. The justices determined that the corruption was so severe, the breach of public trust so fundamental, and the damage to democratic institutions so profound that they had no choice but to act. They invoked rarely used constitutional powers to issue a direct order. Keir Starmer must resign as Prime Minister, not in a few months after an inquiry, not after a parliamentary vote. Now! Immediately, because every day he remains in office represents a continued violation of the principles that underpin British democracy. The legal arguments presented to the court were devastating in their clarity. The prosecution outlined how Starmer had repeatedly failed to declare benefits as required by law. They showed how these undisclosed gifts created clear conflicts of interest in multiple policy areas. They demonstrated that Starmer had access to legal advice warning him of his obligations, meaning he couldn't claim ignorance. Most damning of all, they proved that when confronted with questions about these arrangements, Starmer had provided misleading answers to Parliament. In any other democracy, this would be a resignation-level offence. In Britain, where ministerial standards are supposedly sacrosanct, it should have been career-ending the moment it came to light. Instead, Starmer clung to power, hoping the scandal would blow over, hoping the media would lose interest, hoping he could ride it out. That gamble has now spectacularly failed. The political fallout is already nuclear. Members of Starmer's own party are in open revolt. Backbench MPs who defended him for months are now distancing themselves at record speed. Cabinet ministers are reportedly furious that they were kept in the dark about the extent of the scandal. Opposition parties are demanding immediate elections, calling this the greatest corruption scandal in modern British political history. The public reaction has been even more severe. Trust in government, already at historic lows, has completely collapsed. People who voted for Labour expecting change, expecting integrity, expecting something different from the Conservative chaos that preceded it, feel utterly betrayed. The anger on the streets, on social media, in town halls across the country is palpable and growing by the hour. Behind the scenes, the machinery of government is seizing up. Civil servants don't know who to take orders from. International allies are watching in disbelief as Britain, a supposedly stable democracy, descends into constitutional crisis. Trade negotiations are on hold. Security briefings are being questioned. The entire apparatus of the British state is paralysed because the person at the top has been declared unfit for office by the Supreme Court itself. This isn't a political dispute that can be managed with spin and media appearances. This is a full-blown constitutional emergency with no clear precedent and no obvious resolution. Starmer's team is reportedly exploring every possible legal avenue to challenge the court's order, but constitutional experts are near unanimous. The Supreme Court's authority on this matter is final. There is no higher court to appeal to. There is no political mechanism to override a judicial determination on constitutional grounds. The order stands, and with it, Starmer's political career hangs by the thinnest of threads. What happens in the next 48 hours will determine not just Starmer's fate, but the future of British democracy itself. If a Prime Minister can simply ignore a Supreme Court order, what does that say about the rule of law? If corruption at the highest level goes unpunished, what message does that send to every other politician in the country? These aren't abstract constitutional questions. These are fundamental issues about whether Britain remains a nation governed by laws and institutions, or whether it descends into a system where power protects power and accountability is just a word politicians use against their opponents. The British people are watching. The world is watching. And Keir Starmer is running out of options, running out of time, and running out of places to hide from the consequences of his own corruption. The £124,000 figure that's dominating headlines barely scratches the surface of what investigators have uncovered. Financial forensic experts working with the Supreme Court have traced a web of transactions that paint a picture of systematic corruption spanning Starmer's entire time as Labour leader. The luxury gifts weren't one-time occurrences, but part of an ongoing pattern stretching back years. High-end tailored suits from exclusive Savile Row designers, each worth thousands of pounds, were provided by donors with significant business interests in government contracts. Multiple stays at penthouse apartments in central London, properties worth millions that Starmer used for personal accommodation while claiming he needed them for security reasons. The justification was flimsy at best, fraudulent at worst. Security experts have testified that these luxury arrangements provided no additional safety benefits compared to standard secure accommodations already available to senior politicians. This was about lifestyle, about enjoying privileges that ordinary citizens could never dream of, all funded by people who expected favours in return. The donor list reads like a who's who of individuals seeking influence over government policy. Property developers hoping for favourable planning decisions. Financial sector executives wanting lighter regulatory oversight. Media moguls seeking advantageous positions on broadcasting licences and digital regulations. Every single major donor connected to these undisclosed gifts had specific policy interests that fell directly under government purview, and in multiple documented cases, government decisions favourable to these donors followed shortly after the gifts were provided. The timing isn't coincidental. The pattern is too clear, too consistent, too damning to dismiss as mere coincidence. This is how corruption works in modern democracies. It's not crude briefcases of cash in dark alleys. It's luxury experiences, designer wardrobes, exclusive access, all provided to politicians who then mysteriously make decisions that benefit their benefactors. The sophistication of the scheme doesn't make it any less corrupt. If anything, it makes it more insidious because it's designed specifically to evade scrutiny and operate in the grey zones of political ethics. What's particularly shocking is how Starmer's team tried to justify these arrangements when questions first emerged. The initial response was dismissal, claiming these were minor administrative oversights in declaring gifts. Then the story changed to saying the gifts were properly declared, but in the wrong forms or to the wrong authorities. Then it became about redefining what constituted a gift versus legitimate support for political activities. The constantly shifting explanations revealed a desperate attempt to find any narrative that would minimise the scandal. But each new explanation only raised more questions and exposed more inconsistencies. Parliamentary records show Starmer made multiple declarations about his financial interests over the years, yet somehow these six-figure benefits never appeared in any of them. Either he was deliberately hiding them, which is corruption, or he was so careless with his ethical obligations that he didn't even track benefits worth more than most Britons earn in years, which demonstrates unfitness for office. There's no version of this story where Starmer emerges looking remotely competent or honest. The cover-up intensified as investigative journalists started piecing together the full scope of the scandal. Staffers who tried to raise concerns internally were reportedly sidelined or pressured to stay quiet. One former aide has come forward claiming they were explicitly told to destroy emails relating to certain donor interactions. Legal experts say if this testimony is accurate, it could constitute obstruction of justice and witness tampering, adding criminal dimensions to what was already a catastrophic political scandal. The Supreme Court investigators uncovered deleted calendar entries, scrubbed communication records and financial documents that had been deliberately misfiled to make them harder to locate. This wasn't passive negligence. This was active evidence destruction, the kind of behaviour that suggests the people involved knew exactly how damaging this information would be if it became public. They were right to be worried, but they were catastrophically wrong to think they could bury it forever. Public anger has reached levels not seen since the expenses scandal that rocked Parliament years ago, but this feels different because of who's involved. When Conservative politicians were caught in corruption scandals, many Labour voters could dismiss it as par for the course from a party they already distrusted. But Starmer was supposed to be different. He was the former director of public prosecutions, the man who spent his career prosecuting corruption and holding criminals accountable. He campaigned for Labour leadership on a platform of integrity and honesty. He stood in Parliament week after week demanding resignations from Conservative ministers over far smaller ethical breaches. Every speech he gave about standards in public life now reads like bitter irony. Every accusation he levelled at corrupt politicians now boomerangs back on him with devastating force. The sense of betrayal among Labour supporters is profound and personal. They believed in him, they defended him, they trusted him to be better, and he's proven to be just as corrupt as the politicians he condemned. Perhaps more so because of the staggering hypocrisy involved. The constitutional implications of the Supreme Court's order extend far beyond Starmer's personal fate. Legal scholars are debating whether this sets a precedent for judicial oversight of political ethics that could fundamentally reshape British governance. Traditionally, questions of ministerial conduct were handled through political mechanisms like parliamentary votes or party discipline. The court stayed out of these matters unless actual crimes were involved. But the Supreme Court has now asserted that corruption severe enough to undermine democratic legitimacy falls within their constitutional jurisdiction. They've essentially declared that when political mechanisms fail to hold leaders accountable, when a corrupt Prime Minister refuses to resign despite overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing, the judiciary has the authority and the obligation to intervene. This is revolutionary in the British constitutional context. It means politicians can no longer hide behind parliamentary majorities or party loyalty when they violate the fundamental standards required for democratic governance. The rule of law, the court has declared, supersedes political convenience. Starmer's legal team is reportedly exploring unprecedented arguments to fight the Supreme Court order. But every constitutional expert consulted for this investigation says he's fighting a losing battle. The court's jurisdiction on constitutional matters is final and absolute in the British system. There is no appeal mechanism, there is no higher authority. Some of Starmer's advisors are apparently suggesting he could simply refuse to comply, betting that the court has no enforcement mechanism to physically remove a Prime Minister from office. But this strategy would be political suicide and constitutional vandalism. It would mean a sitting Prime Minister openly defying the Supreme Court, declaring himself above the law, and plunging Britain into a full-scale constitutional crisis that could threaten the entire system of democratic governance. Even Starmer's most loyal supporters recognise this would be catastrophic. The question now isn't whether he can fight the order successfully, because he can't. The question is whether he'll accept reality and resign with whatever shred of dignity remains, or whether he'll drag Britain through a constitutional nightmare that could take years to resolve and permanently damage public faith in democratic institutions. The international ramifications of this crisis are already cascading across the globe in ways that will damage British interests for years to come. Within hours of the Supreme Court order becoming public, foreign ministries in allied nations were issuing carefully worded statements expressing concern about political stability in the United Kingdom. These weren't casual diplomatic observations. They were warning signs that Britain's global standing has taken a catastrophic hit. The United States has reportedly postponed high-level security discussions scheduled for next week, with sources indicating that American officials don't know who will have authority to make binding commitments on behalf of the British government. European Union leaders, already frustrated with Britain's post-Brexit positioning, are watching with a mixture of concern and barely concealed satisfaction at seeing British political chaos that makes their own challenges look minor by comparison. Trade partners across Asia and the Middle East are reassessing agreements and negotiations because they need stability and reliability from the governments they deal with, and Britain right now offers neither. Financial markets have reacted with predictable panic to the constitutional uncertainty. The pound sterling dropped sharply in overnight trading as news of the Supreme Court order spread through financial centres. British government bonds saw yields spike as investors demanded higher returns to compensate for increased political risk. Major corporations with significant UK operations are reportedly convening emergency board meetings to discuss contingency plans if the political situation deteriorates further. This isn't abstract economic theory playing out. This is real money, real jobs, and real consequences for millions of ordinary Britons who had nothing to do with Starmer's corruption but will pay the price through economic instability. Pension funds holding British assets are taking losses. Small businesses that rely on stable economic conditions are facing uncertainty that could force them to delay investments or lay off workers. The economic damage from this political crisis will be measured not in days or weeks, but in years. And the final cost will run into the billions of pounds that Britain can ill afford to lose. Inside Downing Street, the situation has reportedly descended into complete chaos. Staff members are updating their resumes and reaching out to contacts about new positions, recognising that the Starmer government is finished regardless of whether he resigns immediately or tries to fight. Cabinet ministers are frantically calculating their own political futures, trying to distance themselves from Starmer without appearing disloyal to the party. Emergency meetings are happening constantly, but sources say they're achieving nothing because there's no good option available. If Starmer resigns, Labour loses its leader and faces potential collapse. If he refuses to resign, he defies the Supreme Court and creates a constitutional crisis that could destroy public faith in British democracy itself. Every option on the table is catastrophic. The only question is which catastrophe the party chooses to embrace. Meanwhile, actual governance has ground to a halt. Policy decisions are frozen. Legislation is stalled. The machinery of government continues running on autopilot, but without leadership or direction, critical decisions that need to be made are simply being ignored. The opposition parties are preparing for multiple scenarios, each more dramatic than the last. If Starmer resigns, they'll immediately call for a general election, arguing that Labour's mandate has been destroyed by corruption at the very top. Constitutional precedent is mixed on whether a new Prime Minister from the same party can continue governing or whether fresh elections are required when a leader is forced out mid-term. Polling data suggests the British public overwhelmingly wants elections immediately, with trust in the current government essentially non-existent. The Conservative Party, despite its own recent struggles, senses an opportunity to return to power by positioning themselves as the party that will restore integrity to government. The irony of this positioning, given their own corruption scandals, is not lost on anyone, but politics is about seizing opportunities. And the Conservatives are unlikely to let this historic opening pass. Smaller parties are preparing manifestos built around root and branch reform of political ethics, tapping into public fury about corruption that spans both major parties. The long-term damage to British democracy from this scandal extends far beyond Starmer's fate, or even the next election. Public cynicism about politics was already at dangerously high levels after years of scandals, broken promises, and perceived elite indifference to ordinary people's concerns. This scandal confirms every negative stereotype about politicians being corrupt, self-serving, and fundamentally dishonest. When the person who campaigned on integrity and accountability turns out to be as corrupt as everyone he criticised, it reinforces the belief that the entire system is rotten beyond redemption. This kind of deep cynicism is corrosive to democratic participation. Why vote if all politicians are equally corrupt? Why engage with the political system if it's fundamentally rigged in favour of elites who protect each other? These aren't trivial questions. They go to the heart of whether democracy can function when citizens lose all faith in their leaders and institutions. Rebuilding that trust will require more than just Starmer's resignation. It will require fundamental reforms to how political donations are regulated, how conflicts of interest are managed, and how politicians are held accountable when they violate ethical standards. The Supreme Court's decision to intervene, while legally sound, also raises complex questions about the balance of power in British governance. Some constitutional experts warn that judicial intervention in political matters, even when justified by corruption as severe as Starmer's, could set precedents that undermine democratic accountability in different ways. If courts can remove elected leaders, what prevents future judicial overreach into purely political questions? These concerns aren't hypothetical. They're serious considerations about how democratic systems maintain checks and balances without any one branch of government becoming too powerful. The counter-argument, of course, is that the political system had completely failed to hold Starmer accountable, leaving the courts with no choice but to intervene to protect democratic integrity. When political mechanisms break down due to corruption and party loyalty overriding ethical standards, the judiciary becomes the last line of defence for constitutional principles. This tension between political accountability and judicial independence will shape British constitutional debates for decades. The human cost of this scandal is measured not just in abstract political terms, but in real damage to real people's lives. Civil servants who devoted their careers to public service are now tainted by association with a corrupt administration. Labour activists who spent years campaigning for what they believed was honest leadership feel betrayed and humiliated. Young people who are inspired to engage with politics by promises of integrity and change have learned a bitter lesson about how power corrupts even those who claim to be different. These aren't statistics or talking points. They're people who believed in something better and are now confronting the reality that they were deceived. The psychological impact of that betrayal shouldn't be underestimated. It creates the kind of disillusionment that drives people away from democratic participation entirely. And that's a loss that democracy can't afford. Starmer's corruption hasn't just destroyed his own career and damaged his party. It's done lasting harm to the very idea that politics can be a force for good, that leaders can be trusted, that change is possible. Repairing that damage will take a generation, if it's even possible at all. As this crisis reaches its climax, one thing has become absolutely clear. Keir Starmer's time as Prime Minister is over. Whether he resigns today, tomorrow or next week, whether he tries to fight the Supreme Court order or accepts the inevitable, his political career is finished. The £124,000 corruption scandal has destroyed whatever credibility he had left. The Supreme Court order demanding his resignation represents a judgment not just on his ethics, but on his fitness to lead. And the British people, watching this catastrophe unfold, have rendered their own verdict. Trust, once broken, cannot be easily repaired. Leadership, once compromised by corruption, cannot be restored. The only question remaining is how much more damage Starmer will do to British democracy on his way out the door, and whether the country can recover from the wounds his corruption has inflicted on the body politic. History will not be kind to Keir Starmer. His legacy will be defined by betrayal, corruption, and the spectacular fall from grace of a man who promised integrity and delivered the opposite. Claude is the eye and can make mistakes. Please double check responses.